What a time to be a Timberwolves fan. Seriously. It feels like every single day this team gives us something new to think about. And today is one of those days where there are not just one, but two major stories that could say a lot about where Minnesota is headed this season. There are big questions about how this roster is actually going to work once the games begin. And there are also new reasons to believe one of the team's biggest offseason additions might be able to silence a lot of the doubts surrounding him. Both of these stories are connected in a way that could completely shape the Wolves' identity this year. And trust me, the details are much more interesting than they might seem at first. So today, we're breaking down two huge Timberwolves updates. First, we'll talk about why the coaching staff may be preparing for a major change in the way this team plays. Then, we'll get into a fascinating new perspective on one of the roster's biggest question marks that could completely change how fans look at him heading into the season. Before we jump in, if you're a real Timberwolves fan who lives and breathes this team just like I do, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm Henry, and our channel is still brand new. Our first big goal is reaching 100 subscribers, and it would be awesome to have the real Wolves fans here with us from the very beginning. One of the biggest questions surrounding this Timberwolves team has been whether Chris Finch would finally be willing to change one of the habits that has defined him as a head coach. For years, we've watched Finch rely on tight rotations. Even when some fans wanted to see the younger guys get a real opportunity, he usually preferred sticking with the players he trusted the most. Last season was another perfect example of that. Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon Jr., and Jalen Clark all had moments where fans were asking for more minutes. But instead, they were mostly limited to spot appearances, while Minnesota tried to recover from losing Nickel Alexander-Walker. Looking back, it wasn't completely unfair. Nez Reid was one of the best sixth men in the entire NBA, giving the Wolves an elite scoring punch off the bench. While those young players were still trying to find consistency early in the season, as the year went on, things started changing. Bones Hyland emerged as a valuable contributor, and the trade for Ayo Dosunmu gave Minnesota another dependable option in the back. Suddenly, the bench looked much stronger, and Finch had more players he could actually trust during meaningful minutes. But now, the situation has completely changed again. With Naz Reid now in Charlotte, the Timberwolves no longer have that proven game-changing scorer leading the second unit, unless Finch decides to move Ayo Dosunmu back to the bench. Minnesota enters the season without an established high-level sixth man. On top of that, there's another issue that everyone around the organization recognizes. They simply don't have a natural power forward on the roster. And honestly, this is where things get really interesting. Instead of forcing players into traditional roles, Finch may have to completely rethink how he manages this team. Rather than using his usual 8 or 9-man rotation, Minnesota could open the season experimenting with a much deeper group just to figure out what combinations actually work. There are several reasons why that makes sense. First, LaMelo Ball has dealt with injuries throughout his NBA career. Last season, he averaged just 28 minutes per game, and managing his workload will almost certainly be a priority. That alone creates more opportunities for other guards to stay involved throughout games. Then, you look at the current bench. Joan Behringer appears ready for a significant role as an energetic backup big man. Bones Hyland is expected to become the primary backup point guard. Terrence Shannon Jr. looks like the team's spark plug scorer off the bench. That already gives Minnesota what feels like a solid top 8 rotation. But it still doesn't solve the biggest roster problem. Who defends opposing power forwards? That's where players like Josh Green and Jalen Clark could become much more important than people realize. Josh Green brings the classic 3-on-D skill set every contender values, while Jalen Clark has already earned a reputation for relentless perimeter defense. Both could potentially spend time guarding bigger wings and even some power forwards depending on the matchup. There's also the possibility that Minnesota adds another veteran. Georges Niang has been mentioned as someone who could provide rotational minutes if the Timberwolves decide to strengthen the frontcourt before the season begins. When you put all those names together, Minnesota suddenly has something they really didn't have before. Options. The difference between Terrence Shannon Jr., Josh Green, Jalen Clark, Bones Hyland, Joan Behringer, and potentially Georges Niang isn't massive. Instead of relying on one fixed rotation every night, Finch may actually have the flexibility to mix and match depending on the opponent. And that's exactly what he hinted at during his recent conversation with John Kravchinsky of The Athletic. Finch said, "I see the opportunity to be creative with that. Maybe. Every night. Maybe it's a different person starting at the 4 based on who we're playing. Why not? That quote says a lot. It tells us the coaching staff already understands there isn't one obvious answer at power forward. Rather than pretending they've solved the problem, they're embracing versatility. One night, it could be one player starting at the 4. The next night, it could be someone completely different depending on whether they're facing a bigger, stronger front court or a faster, more athletic lineup. Honestly, that's probably the smartest approach. The NBA has become increasingly matchup-driven, and many successful teams are using deeper rotations than ever before. If Minnesota doesn't have a traditional answer at power forward, throwing different defensive looks at opponents may actually become one of their biggest strengths instead of a weakness. There's even another possibility. Finch could still use a standard 9-man rotation while making that 9th spot completely matchup dependent. Either way, flexibility appears to be becoming the identity of this roster. And speaking of flexibility, that leads perfectly into our second story today, because one player could quietly solve part of Minnesota's biggest concern without even being known as a great defender. Let's talk about LaMelo Ball. Now, let's move to the second story, because I honestly think this one deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. Ever since LaMelo Ball arrived in Minnesota, the biggest concern everyone has talked about has been his defense. And to be fair, those concerns aren't made up. Throughout his career with the Charlotte Hornets, Ball has struggled to become a consistently positive defender. His thin frame can make it difficult for him to handle stronger players physically. And there have been plenty of possessions where his off-ball focus simply wasn't where it needed to be. So, yes, if you're worried about his defense, you're definitely not alone. But here's the part that I think many people are overlooking. LaMelo Ball is far from being a complete liability on that end of the floor. And one underrated part of his game could become incredibly valuable for this Timberwolves roster. His rebounding. For his NBA career, LaMelo has averaged 5.7 rebounds per game, which is outstanding production for a point guard. Even more impressive, according to Data Baller, he ranked in the 99th percentile in defensive rebounding percentage for players at his position. That isn't just good, it puts him among the very best rebounding guards in basketball. And when you think about Minnesota's current roster construction, that becomes a huge deal. As we just discussed, the Timberwolves don't have a natural power forward. That creates obvious concerns in the front court, especially when it comes to controlling the defensive glass against bigger lineups. No, LaMelo Ball isn't suddenly going to replace a traditional power forward. But can he help keep Minnesota from getting dominated on the boards? Absolutely. His ability to consistently grab defensive rebounds could help stabilize one of the team's biggest weaknesses, while also reducing some of the impact of his defensive limitations. This exact point was recently highlighted by John Kravchinski of The Athletic. Kravchinski explained that Minnesota may have to play unconventionally early in the season. Chris Finch even mentioned that Anthony Edwards could spend time defending physically stronger power forwards like Zion Williamson and Jaren Jackson Jr., depending on the matchup. At the same time, Kravchinski noted that the Timberwolves will likely rely heavily on LaMelo Ball's rebounding to help compensate for their lack of front court size. And honestly, when you hear it explained that way, it starts making a lot of sense. Defense isn't only about blocking shots or locking someone down one-on-one. Finishing defensive possessions by securing the rebound is just as important. That's one of the areas where LaMelo consistently delivers. Every defensive rebound immediately creates transition opportunities, and that's exactly the style Minnesota wants to play, with Anthony Edwards leading the attack. But that's not the only encouraging sign. According to B-Ball Index, LaMelo ranked in the 73rd percentile in overall screener defense, meaning he's actually been a solid screen navigator. Combined with his 6'7" size, that allows him to defend opposing wing shooters at a respectable level, even if he'll probably never be considered an elite stopper. And then you look at the environment he's walking into. This isn't Charlotte anymore. LaMelo has never played behind a rim protector like Rudy Gobert. He has never shared the perimeter with a defender like Jaden McDaniels. The Timberwolves have built one of the NBA's strongest defensive cultures over the past few seasons, and that kind of structure can make life much easier for a player who doesn't have to carry the entire defensive burden by himself. Instead of asking LaMelo to become an all-defensive player overnight, Minnesota simply needs him to compete. Stay engaged, rebound at the level he's always shown he can, and avoid becoming a weak link. If he does that, The overall picture suddenly looks much more encouraging than many people expected. That's why I think some of the early criticisms surrounding his fit has been a little premature. Will there still be difficult matchups? Of course. Will opposing teams try to attack him at times? Without question. But when you factor in his elite rebounding for a guard, his respectable ability to navigate screens, the protection provided by Rudy Gobert, the perimeter defense of Jaden McDaniels, the versatility of Anthony Edwards, and the defensive system that Chris Finch has built in Minnesota, it's much easier to see a path where LaMelo Ball becomes a successful piece of this team instead of the defensive liability many people are predicting. And if that happens, these two stories we've talked about today become even more connected. A deeper, more flexible rotation, combined with LaMelo embracing the dirty work on the glass, could be exactly what allows this unusual Timberwolves roster to work far better than many people around the league currently expect. When you step back and look at both of today's stories together, I think they reveal something really important about where the Timberwolves are right now. This isn't a roster that's trying to replace one player with another and keep everything exactly the same. This team is evolving. Chris Finch seems ready to be more flexible than we've seen in previous years. And that flexibility may end up becoming one of Minnesota's biggest strengths instead of something fans should worry about. Losing Naz Reid is a significant change. There's no point pretending otherwise. He gave this team instant offense, experience, and stability every time he stepped onto the floor. Replacing that production won't fall on just one player. It'll have to come from everyone. Bones Highland, Ayodosun Mu, Terrence Shannon Jr., Joan Behringer, Josh Green, Jalen Clark, and possibly even a veteran addition like Georges Niang all have a chance to carve out meaningful roles. At the same time, LaMelo Ball may end up helping this roster in ways that don't always show up in highlight reels. If he continues to rebound at an elite level for his position, competes defensively, and takes advantage of playing alongside defensive anchors like Rudy Gobert and Jaden McDaniels, he could prove that many of the concerns surrounding his fit were overstated. Of course, there are still plenty of unanswered questions. Can Minnesota consistently defend bigger front courts without a natural power forward? Will Chris Finch actually commit to a deeper rotation once the regular season begins? Can the younger players take advantage of the extra opportunities they'll likely receive? And can LaMelo Ball stay healthy while making the impact this organization believes he's capable of making? Those answers won't come overnight, but one thing is becoming very clear. The Timberwolves aren't afraid to try something different. Instead of forcing this roster into a traditional mold, they're embracing versatility, creativity, and matchup basketball. In today's NBA, that might be exactly what separates good teams from championship contenders. As fans, that's honestly something to be excited about. There will probably be growing pains early in the season. There will be lineups that work and others that don't. But if this coaching staff finds the right combinations, Minnesota could end up being one of the most unpredictable and one of the most dangerous teams in the Western Conference. Now, I want to hear from all of you. Do you think Chris Finch should expand the rotation this season, or would you still rather see him stick with a tighter group? And what are your expectations for LaMelo Ball? Do you believe his rebounding and the Timberwolves' defensive system will be enough to overcome the concerns about his defense? Let me know what you're thinking down in the comments, because I know Wolves fans are going to have plenty of opinions about both of these topics. If you enjoyed today's update, don't forget to leave a like, because it really helps the channel grow. And if you're a true Timberwolves fan who believes in what this team is building, make sure you subscribe. I'm Henry, and we're building this community from the ground up. The channel is still brand new, and our first goal is reaching 100 subscribers. If you want to follow every important Timberwolves update and be part of this community from the very beginning, we'd love to have you with us. Thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate every single one of you for spending a few minutes here with me today. I can't wait to see what this team does next, and I'll be back as soon as another big Timberwolves story breaks. Until next time, let's keep believing in the Wolves.